Right then, so this is part 2 of how are we planning on exposing the state of an initializing product analytics stack to the front end. So we started yesterday, but we were all kind of under time constraints. And I think we got a bit further, but I don't think we actually nailed down an actual solution. So I'll share my screen and hopefully we can begin to collaborate on something. So where me and Rob got to yesterday was we could create a, can you both see my screen all right, sorry? Oh,
now we
yes?
can't.
Oh.
We had it, and then you decided.
Oh, did you put your thumbs up? Sorry, for some reason
yeah.
the Zoom preview has disappeared from my screen, so I can't actually see. Okay, so thought we create a Redis key that's populated before we enqueue the job, which then we delete on success or failure, and then expose the Jitsu key for in the project type GraphQL type, and then create a new type that can store some other initialization methods. And I was okay with that, but I believe Jiaan had some concerns, which I think are probably reasonable. So do you want to outline those?
Sorry, I was muted. Sure, I did post a comment if you scroll down on the MR. Oh, never mind.
All right, I'm just gonna reshare because something's not quite working.
But I'll quickly voice over my comment that I just posted there, so that it's also available asynchronously. The main thing that we're trying to solve is we're trying to stop the initialize job from running successfully more than once.
Mm-hmm.
That's like at its core, that's really what this issue is about. Also to sprinkle in some, I guess, past experience and advice about like how the state management can be done easily. Because I've seen it work quite nicely where you basically have this, and I call it the simple state machine, but it really doesn't have to be a proper state machine. Mm. I've seen it work both without and with, where you just have a method, and that's what I thought we could start out with. But the implementation plan that you guys have here, I think, would work. I think it's still open to the edge case that we're blocking it in the front end only and not in the back end, because presumably we'd be able to call the backend via some API, and without the backend having checks in place to actually block that initialization job from ever starting, it would still be possible to, even though that's quite an extreme edge case. But that led me to thinking, why not just, and I mean like purely block it in the backend? Then we don't need, like, that would be the most simplest, boring solution in my mind as a first iteration, where we only block it in before we call initialization service. Mm-hmm. The front end experience would be that if, and this is on the rare occurrence, that if a job is running and they land on that page and they click that button, they would get an error, which I think would be perfectly reasonable. And the error could be someone else is running this currently, try again in a few moments. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable user experience, especially for a first start. Okay. That also simplifies the front end in that we don't need to constantly be aware of this loading state. I do think we can still follow up on this with like a more state machine approach. It's going to simplify it a bit, especially as we add more, because we're going to follow up with like more connection details. It's no longer just going to be on the instance. You're going to be able to set a connection on the project. You're going to be asked for some questions about like where this data should be stored, etc., etc. So as we evolve on this, I do think we need to, or we should, reconsider like how we do our state going forward. But for now, I think simply checking in the backend would solve like the core issue.
Okay, so I'm trying to think in real terms. Then, from a backend point of view, that looks like, so that Redis key that I've proposed already would remain in place, but instead of passing that to the front end, we would just block it at that point. I might even have the code open.
The answer is basically saying that you'd have a check on the worker, so the worker wouldn't be triggered on the you wouldn't call the worker if the Redis key exists, essentially.
Yeah. So here's where we initialize the worker. So oh, it's the wrong branch, but here we would set a Redis key. But then also what within the worker, we check if it exists and return from the worker early if it does.
I would say that you'd create the Redis key in the worker and check if it exists in the service, personally.
You end up with a race condition there, though, in case the worker isn't executed for a few seconds, that the key hasn't been set. On a large self-managed instance.
What clears the
within
key?
The bounds plus.
Because I think the thing that clears it is the thing that should set it.
The thing that clears it should be the completion of the worker.
I think then it should be in the worker, shouldn't it?
But what happens if you initialize the job, you enqueue the job hasn't been executed for 10, 20 seconds. There's no way of knowing.
Right.
So you should do it once it's enqueued, because then you're saying, hey, right, the job is going to happen, even if it's not happened yet. We know it's going to happen, hopefully fairly soon. But there's no guarantee, especially for self-managed, that will happen incredibly fast.
So what happens in the event that a worker fails to happen? And we've just got this key stuck, like the retries fail continuously and the worker just never fires.
I think we can rescue from retries. I'll have to check that. If the worker never fires, that's a different problem entirely. We could set a timeout on the Redis key so that if it's not been deleted within an hour, then we can just remove it ourselves.
I have a stupid question.
I like stupid questions.
The documentation for GitLab says that we should avoid exposing the sidekick Redis to APIs, but did it say anything about using it in our in this worker or outside where it's being called?
Is this the thing that you were talking about yesterday, Rob?
Yes.
Because why even add our own Redis key if we can just ask sidekick? Because sidekick is going to be the single source of truth for what's happening to that job.
So I think the thing you're referring to there is the documentation says not to fiddle about with Sidekick's own Redis implementation, because Sidekick essentially uses Redis quite heavily. We're not doing that. We're using GitLab's shared Redis state, which, as far as I'm aware, is fine to access as part of a worker. What we can't do is write a sidekick.redis command, which then goes in and manually alters the queue. Which is
but we can query the queue state. Or rather, make that an open question. What do you think about that?
That's what we're not supposed to do according to the docs.
Okay. In that case, we'll need a new Redis key for this. But yeah, either way, there is some complexity here, because I can see how if you call a job that never gets executed, then it's indefinitely going to be blocked.
Yes, so that's why. So Redis allows you to set the key with a timeout. So we can set the key and say, sorry, not a timeout, an expiration. So the key is automatically deleted after a certain number of minutes. But we'd have to set that quite high, which could be annoying if you run the job, it's failed for some reason and there's nothing you can do about it. Don't know what the right answer to that is, other than saying this might not be a long-term solution, but it is the quickest and most boring.
I think it's fine for a first iteration, because Redis jobs are also we can risk, or not Redis jobs, Sidekick jobs are rescuable.
Yes.
Should we need to ever do that? But for this, I don't think that's completely necessary. And if this becomes an issue, we can always just improve on it. But what do the two of you? What do the two of you think about my original suggestion or idea about doing this purely in the backend as a first iteration, especially Rob, I guess, because it sounds like you're quite keen on that, Max.
I'm super flexible at this point. I kind of want to do whatever's going to make the front end as responsive and as least reliant on things like polling APIs as possible, because I know those things get messy.
I am happy to do this as an initial approach. My thinking with this issue was twofold. One, preventing someone from rerunning the job, but two, also to know on the front end in which state we're in, to show the loading screen for the initialization state if we know that we're initializing, which we would know from the Redis key, or whether to show that you haven't done anything about this yet. Do you want to set this up? It sounds like the approach we're going to go for initially won't allow us to do that second point at all. Instead would show an error, which I'd like to see a design for, because we don't have any kind of error screen or any error state at all at the minute. For that,
We can start with a flash. What do you think?
Yeah, I guess. Well, we have to. It just won't be very ideal from a user experience perspective. That's all. But I guess for initial, it's fine. In terms of a longer term idea of a state machine, we need to have a conversation about that, just because we've built half the APIs already for a lot of what the state machine is going to query, which might end up being redundant, and how we want to handle that. But that's a future us conversation.
That does bring up like why I suggested the state machine, or a simple version of it at this stage, is because yeah, this is something that I've seen really simplifies an onboarding process from the start.
Yeah,
it is something that we can iterate on, because it is not the most boring solution, but the most boring solution isn't always the most sensible one. Let's say it's a good rule of thumb to think about, but it's not something we need to follow like our holy book.
I'm kind of easy at this point. I don't really mind, which I know is a terrible answer to this complex problem. It sounds like we've got kind of 2 or 3 possible ways forward, and we kind of just need to pick one. So kind of depends what you guys want on the front end to be available in the first iteration. If you just want an error where someone can hit that button as many times as you want and it just doesn't work, that's fine. We can just return an error in the API. I'm trying to think now, is there currently an API that allows you to initialize the stack, or does that only happen in the console?
I think it's only a console thing. Don't think there's an API yet.
So if we're to do that, I need to do the backend work to make us aware that there is a stack being initialized, which expires after a certain number of minutes, and then also expose a GraphQL mutation, I guess, that allows you to initialize that stack creation.
Yeah, the latter we'll need in any case.
Yeah, we'll need that anyway,
Yeah.
but we'll want that to fail if the stack is currently being initialized.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. Like my suggestion that I have like on this call and at the end of yesterday's call is really just following what I feel like the implementation plan that you guys came up with, is just to try and simplify this as much as possible for first iteration.
Mm-hmm.
So my thinking is kind of like, can we simplify this even further? I'm still very much in favor of going the state machine route, but if we want like the simplest thing that we can do for a start, I feel like this is probably it. But
that's where I'm leaning
that's
to,
my 2
just
cents.
because we want to, like, the state machine is going to take longer. It's going to be a not insignificant amount of work. Whereas what we've just discussed will be possibly something I can get in review by the end of this week, which would be nice.
That would be tomorrow or today, because tomorrow is Friends.
Oh no, I forgot Friends Family Day tomorrow. Okay, I don't make promises like that. I didn't say that. But in terms of relative effort, it's much lower.
From my perspective, I do want to eventually see a state machine. I think the states defined so far in the issue are too far. The disabled, we wouldn't render the page in the first place, and that's a Hamel check, whether it's disabled or not. Right now we don't render anything if it's disabled. There's no menu item. There's nothing. It's a 404. So there's no need for that to be in the state machine. And the no dashboards, that's where it goes too far, in my opinion, because we move on from onboarding into a completely separate API structure, which is the listing concept, which is a GraphQL endpoint anyway. But the whole, do we have an instance? Are we creating the instance? Do we have any data? That are the three things that the back end is best able to handle, and that's where a single source of truth starts to come in for me. But to do that, first and foremost, we need to have this Redis key anyway. So having a Redis key as a first port of call with a 404 with an error on the front end, if you try to make this call via the API, works for me. We can then create that state machine to then check these queries on the front end as the next step, if that makes sense. So check, do we have an instance at all created? No. Do we have are we creating an instance? Yes or no? And then do we have any data at all in Cube right now? Yes or no?
Okay, that sounds good. So from initialization and implementation point of view,
sorry, what Rob just described, it feels like that's 70% of the original proposal, though.
Yes.
So
as a next step, not as a now. So the first step is this Redis key that we need that anyway to be able to do the state machine. So we might as well get that in and do what you suggested with the simplest thing of creating that error. If someone tries to hit that API endpoint, just at all, then we can move on. The next step after that is, as you suggest, going into that state machine because we still need to add the Jitsu key anyway for us to be able to create all these different screens and tie them together using the router, don't we, Jiaan? So there's still back-end work to be done on top of just a Redis key right now.
Okay. Okay. How much time have we got? We've got 5 minutes or so. So let's go through the implementation plan and adjust where necessary for this point. So populating a Redis key, fine with, and deleting it. We should also include an expire. And we'll delete that either on expiry or completion or failure of the Sidekick job after whatever the default number of retries is. I can't remember. You think we still need the Jitsu key in the project type, Rob?
We do, but that shouldn't, because we're not touching APIs, that shouldn't be part of this work here. All of that I feel like we should move to as the next issue, create a new issue to handle state machine as the next step. I don't know if anyone agrees.
In this issue, then what we should be doing is creating a mutation which calls this service here, but also fails and returns an error if that Redis key is still in existence.
So you mean creating the API to start that service?
Yes.
That service.
It would be a GraphQL mutation because it's just a GraphQL that isn't querying, it's doing, but we're not mutating anything, technically speaking.
Yes. Can we tie that or link that to the concept that we want to eventually create a simple state machine on a GraphQL instance or endpoint or somewhere? Nomenclature is what I'm thinking of, making sure that we're naming it in such a way that it becomes clear that they're linked.
Yeah, so I guess this would, for this mutation would, its only purpose would be to attempt the initialization of the product analytics stack, and it would return, I guess, the current state, which in this case would either be it's already initializing So I've not done anything, or I've enqueued the job. That's all it would be aware of at that point. There's no reason that afterwards we couldn't create a meta type like we've got here, or a status type, or whatever it's called, which would then combine all that information and say, hey, right now I know the state is that it is initializing, or that it is not currently initializing, or that it's been created, for example. That would be fine. Again, I don't know if we can technically call it a state machine because I'm not storing the state explicitly anywhere, but we can infer it from the other information we've got.
What's the name for a state machine that doesn't require storing the state?
I guess it's still a state machine because
it's still a state machine. It's just a
as long
very
as it's
simple
only
state
in one
machine.
state. Yes.
People use big words for things that I've conceptually used my entire career, but I've never used them, the words that other people use to explain it.
Like that's why my pseudocode here is literally just a bunch of like guard clauses, and that's it. But that is it tells you what you go check the current state, and it tells you what the next step is. Yeah. That's a state machine.
I guess we want it to return the current state, or the yeah.
Returns enqueued or error, essentially.
Yeah. I'm still getting used to this keyboard.
Or you were just typing Spanish.
Yeah. No, I mean, I might as well be. And then we can move this to
I wonder if we shouldn't keep this issue, because this issue is already API to retrieve the state of a project analytics stack. If we shouldn't just create a new one for blocking the job if a worker is currently running into a new small issue, without the need to recreate all this.
I mean, move this into a separate issue.
Yeah, move this into a separate small issue that is related to this one, and it's just to stop the worker from running twice.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. Well, I'll do that after this call, so you guys don't have to watch me fumble about with my keyboard. That's fine.
I don't know. It was entertaining for me.
It's exhausting. One day I'll get there, but my typing speed is literally less than half of what it is on an old school keyboard. But my wrist no longer hurts. I'm putting up with it and trying to get better, but man, it's slow going. Is there anything else we want to discuss about this for now?
No, we front-end wise, we need to capture the fact that we need to return an error on the screen. So I'll update the issue for the creation screen to reflect that we need to make sure that we render any errors from the API. And then we need to, I guess, refine what we want to show in this next iteration, this state machine process. So that's a future problem us.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, well, from this, I will now, straight after this call, go make a cup of tea and then extract this into its own issue, assign it to myself, and probably get started on that today. So hopefully we can have something to review. Well, there should be something to review today because there's not going to be a huge amount of work. And then we'll go from there. Sound good?
Great. Thanks so much.
Sweet.
Thank you.
See you later, folks.
Cool.
Ciao.
See ya. Ciao.